Hello and welcome to the first part of what will hopefully be a longer series of videos in which I explain different decks and I provide gameplay video to show how those decks play out. My name is Lord Perf, I'm a longtime Eternal player and member of Team Lord Toughrod, and I was providing deck lists on Eternal Warcry for quite some time now. I try to write build-ups for them to explain how they get played, but I also wanted to try out making videos and other kind of Eternal content for quite some time now. And now that I have better equipment, I can finally do it. The first deck that I want to talk about is an FPS Tesseract deck. The general game plan is completely focused around Align the Tesseract, which summons a 12/12 Tesseract Prime that has decay, gives all of your spells decay, and if you deal damage with a spell, you can draw 2 cards. And you can reduce the cost of Align the Tesseract by 3 if you sacrifice grenadines for it. Which means, to make this deck work, you want 2 packages. You want a lot of grenadines to get Tesseract out for cheap early, and you want a lot of cheap spells that deal damage so that you can cycle through your deck after you play the Tesseract. You usually have like a 2 to 3 turn clock after you play the Tesseract if your opponent doesn't have an out, and it's pretty difficult to get rid of Tesseract. She doesn't die to Annihilate because she's a multi-faction unit. She can of course get Silence, but then you still have a 12/12 on board. The best outs that are widely played right now are the 6 mana Icaria that even Fane plays, and Equivocate in Elysian. And Kira has Pristine Light in the market, but you can protect yourself pretty well against all those cards with the market. I talk about that later. Now to the individual card choices. I kinda already explained that you basically have 2 packages, or 2.5 if you count the Tesseract package as another single package. The first package, the Grenadine, consists of basically all units except for Jotun Hurler and Assembly Line. Gleaming Grenadine is just a cheap Grenadine that's resilient because if it gets removed in some way, you still have another Grenadine on the board. Grenadine Drone is another cheap Grenadine. It's really important for Tesseract because it reduces the cost of Tesseract by 5 basically. So you pay 1 mana, but then you Align the Tesseract costs 6 mana less because you can sacrifice 2 Grenadines now. Chunk Obstructor is another cheap Grenadine, and I didn't have it in the first build, but I really felt like I need something that can fix my influence and help me to get free power. With Chunk Obstructor, you can keep a lot more hands than without, because you can basically keep 2 power hands now sometimes. Sparking Vermin is really important because it immediately allows you to draw 2 cards if you sacrifice it for Align the Tesseract, and it's of course another cheap Grenadine for Tesseract. Grenahan, one of the new cards for the deck. We saw it a lot in the last Throne Open, in even Fane and in Praxis Trove, but it's also really good in this deck because it can either draw your Grenadines, it can draw your Jotun Hurler, which means you have a cheap damage spell for your Tesseract, and it can also draw you a lot of your spells. The only cards it can't draw in this deck are Align the Tesseract, Realign the Stars, and Assembly Line, which means you have 38 targets overall, which means that you have a really high chance to draw something with Grenahan. The other new card is Crafty Occultist, which is a really good card, also played in most FPS Trove lists at the Throne Open. I really wanted to play 4, I played 4 for a long time. I cut 2 because it kind of feels too slow in this deck sometimes, and it only provides 1 Grenadine and not even all the time. It's still a really good card to fix your hand and to get some tempo, like a solid blocker, because this deck doesn't really have good blockers otherwise. Grenahan is a solid blocker against aggro, but this card can help to get some board presence while you try to assemble your Tesseract. And the last card of the Grenadine package is Assembly Line, which really helps turboing out Tesseract. It basically reduces the cost of it by 6 mana. Now to the small Tesseract package, which is basically your win condition plus a 3 mana way to find your win condition. It's not extremely efficient to realign the stars for Tesseract, but you really need Tesseract to win most of the games. So you need some way to get it more consistent, and realign the stars is the best way to do that. Realign the stars gets accomplished by one other amplify card that it can get if you really want to, which is one copy of Vicious Overgrowth. This is also not a really efficient play. You basically pay 5 mana to deal 3 damage, but I really like the flexibility that it provides. Sometimes you also already have a Tesseract and don't need another, and you need a damage spell. Vicious Overgrowth is also really good in this deck because Torch can't hit sides. So against Kira, for example, if you want to hit their tower, you can tutor for Overgrowth, which is pretty expensive, but sometimes you need it. For the other damage spells, we have Torch, which is just a really efficient 1 mana damage spell. Can't really get more efficient than that. Then what I already explained, which is Overgrowth. Then Display of Menace, which has 3 different modes, none of which is extremely efficient, but they are all useful in some kind of way in this deck and against some of the decks in this meta. The AoE is just a mode to draw cards with Align the Tesseract, especially helpful because it deals decay damage, so it makes every unit of the opponent smaller and kills the really small units. The second mode kills a relic, which is good against Sling and sometimes FPS Drove, of course. And the last mode can is basically Devour for more specific cards, which is not extremely efficient, but sometimes you don't draw your Tesseract and you want to draw deeper in your deck, and you usually have something to sacrifice. And the last damage spell is Blazing Salvo, which is again a relatively efficient removal, but also really useful because it provides flexibility. And Jotunhurler is basically a damage spell, which has the upside of providing you fodder for your crafty occultist that you can discard, for Jump Extractor to plunder, and for Blazing Salvo to have a free card that you can put away to grab something from the market. Now to the 5 market cards. Cyber Combustion is an option to punish decks that go wide. It's really, really good if you have a Tesseract out, because then the damage has decay again, and you draw 2 cards. Dazzle is a solid way to protect your Tesseract, also to protect from hand attack effects like Exploit, or some people even play Rain of Rocks for some reason. So you can keep a Blazing Salvo, and then if they play something that you don't want to see played, play Blazing Salvo, grab Dazzle, and negate. It costs 3 mana, which can be a lot, but if you basically only lose if they have an out for Tesseract, then it's usually worth it to keep that mana open. Edict of Shafgar is a solid removal spell. It kills basically everything in Kira. It still gets negated by Silverplate Intrusion, but it gets around Bubble Shield. It's also solid against Fane. It usually doesn't kill the Champion of Cunning because they give it Region and it has 6/6, but it can kill still some things. It can kill Felrauch, it can kill Marvel of Tundras. It's not terribly efficient in this matchup, but sometimes you can get it. And it's pretty solid against the usual primal mid-range decks, mostly Elysian, because it kills Charal. It kills Womb, at least before he transforms. And it can even kill Womb after he transforms if you Blazing Salvo the Womb and then get Edict of Shafgar. Reread can redraw basically either you align the Tesseract if the first got killed, or if you milled it with Brennerhan. And it can, of course, also redraw any of the other damage spells if you just need to deal damage to something, want to draw more cards with Tesseract, or need a relic removal again, or even if you dazzled one time, you can get a dazzle back to have another protection. And Royal Decree is mostly here for things that you can't negate with dazzle. So it counters the 6 mana Icaria against Evenfane, also helps that it turns off even-handed golems in this matchup. because 6-mana Icaria is something that you can't really play around otherwise. You usually try to get Tesseract around turn 4, which means you have like at least 1 or 2 turns before the Icaria comes down. But sometimes you have a slower hand, your opponent interrupted you and it takes longer, and then it really sucks if you play Tesseract and it immediately gets destroyed by Icaria, so you have Royal Decree for that, in theory. And the last thing I want to talk about is the power base. I'm not a particularly good power base builder, because I usually build them with trial and error. Like, I look into power bases of other people and try to have some general ideas about how to build them, but I'm like mostly trial and error. This power base already changed a lot over the time I played this deck, and I think it's in a pretty good space now. The influence that you need for this deck is 1 fire, 2 primal, and 2 shadow. So the influence should be focused on primal and shadow and less on fire, but you try to get fire early to maybe get one of these 1-drops out and to have your damage spells ready. Currently, the deck has 12 fire influence, 15 primal influence, and 19 shadow influence with this power base. So bigger focus on shadow than primal, because you have a higher chance to blunder into primal with Chunk Obstructor. Especially because of Jotun Hurler, but in general you have 13 cards that safely blunder into primal, but you don't have any card that safely blunders into shadow. The general idea of the power base is to play paintings on turn 1 and 2, then to have some unit on the board, like one of the cheap grenadines, which means that you have banners active from turn 3 onwards. What is kinda awkward is the Crest of Cunning, but I really felt like I needed another Feign duel, and Crest was the best thing that I could find here. I tried Feign Wo, but I don't really like that. I think you really need a duel to get 2 influence at one time. Quests and paintings is kinda awkward because you want to play both of those on turn 1 or 2 optimally. But it usually still works out. It makes some hands a bit slower, but the deck can sometimes take it a bit slower. It's also often correct for this deck, especially against Hailstorm decks, to not actually play too many grenadines early. Like, the damage to deal with grenadines early isn't too important, which is more important that you have enough grenadines later to play your Tesseract for cheap. Like, Gleaming Grenadine is always fine to play in Chunk Obstructor, and Grenahan, of course, because it just replaces itself most of the time. But Grenadine Drone and Vermin I sometimes keep in the hand until I can play Tesseract, because they basically Vermin replaces itself with the 2 cards you draw from Snipe, and Drone is just much more valuable if you play it exactly before Tesseract, because if your opponent removes the 2 drones, you actually lose more tempo than you gain if you play drone and immediately sacrifice it, because you basically get 5 power back from that. And the last basically flex spot in the power base are the 2 Diplo Seals, which also are kind of awkward with banners and Grust, because you also want to play the Diplo Seals early, because later on they don't give influence anymore. But it's still fine to trade and draw them later on, usually because you already have your influence ready by then, because you only need 5 influence for this deck. Sometimes it's still correct to play them on 1, even if you have crests and paintings, because you maybe want to play a Grenadine on 1. But it's also often fine to just have them draw them later and don't get any influence with this deck. Yeah, this was the deck tech part, and I will record a gameplay part later and probably upload both videos at the same time.